Hello and welcome back to Perspectives. Yes, we are back. In today's show, we look at the shocking situation of a young Sikh here in the UK, pressured by the police into admitting he was being radicalised for highlighting the 1984 Sikh Genocide. Just what is the government's agenda against the British Sikh community? And talking of agenda, the Hindu American Foundation warns of rampant Hindu phobia running out of control in the United States. Except it isn't, as even the Jewish community now joins the Sikh community in pointing out this uncomfortable fact. And of course it's Hindutva agenda. And the mention of Air India is always a provocative subject, and with that in mind we'll discuss the recent Flight 171 crash in Ahmedabad. And in Canada, a subject always close to Sikhs' heart is sport, and we'll take a quick look at the Canada Cup International Women's Softball Tournament just finishing in British Columbia. All this and more on today's show. But joining me, as always, from British Columbia itself is our very own correspondent in Canada, James Cousineau. Good morning, James.
Good day, Angus, and good day to our viewers. Welcome back. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for your patience while we were away. And Angus had the helm doing some abbreviated shows. So again, make sure your comments come in, and make sure that you let us know where you're watching from, and thanks for coming back.
Indeed. And together, James and I will be bringing you our perspectives on the daily news affecting the Sikh community across the world. And as usual, we'll take a look at loads of great comments, which have been filling up in our absence beneath the video. So do stay tuned for that. Right, James, let's get underway. What are you going to start us off with this morning?
Well, since we were away during the week, well, I wasn't really away. I was down the road at Softball City here in Surrey, British Columbia, where we welcomed the world for the World Women's International Softball Tournament. And it was an exciting week filled with the regular teams as well as the futures. And those are the under-18s, the under-16s. And it was an amazing event. We welcomed teams from the Netherlands, from Canada, of course, across our great nation, the United States, and a little spoiler there for you, the United States beat us, and well, that's okay. We came back to beat them, and we made it to the gold game, but an American team, Triple Crown, Colorado, they outdid us in the gold game, so they win the gold medal. Again, Canada winning the silver, and the Netherlands coming up behind it, taking home the bronze. We also saw teams from Ukraine, from Israel, from Chinese Taipei, and all over the globe. It was an exciting event, very well hosted, no issues going on. One of the sad things, Angus, that I noted while I was there is that the team from Israel actually was the only team that required security at their dugout and to escort them around the city just to be sure that there were no protesters and nothing went silly. But again, it worked out well. All the teams played to their heart's content. I've got a couple of images here that I just thought I would share because I got back to the studio late. They actually just finished just over an hour ago handing out the awards, the trophies, and all of the excitement that goes with it. So I had to dash back, get to the studio, get ready to come on tonight. Hence no tie. I just threw on the jacket over my golf shirt, and here we are. But again, here's Chinese Taipei, Team Canada here. And they played a great game. And then again tonight, they again, as I said, hosted as the Triple Crown Colorado, kicked our butt. But it was a great game right down to the final inning, right to the bottom of the seventh, which is in softball, the final inning. So it was exciting. There were also the other games that happened today. The under-19s played. And again, it was just a week full of excitement and welcoming people from around the globe. So it was awesome. I really encourage, if you are out and about next year in this area, then take in a game or two. The excitement is just off the charts. And here you have one of the players from Chinese Taipei ready for that ball to be hit right to her. But let me tell you, it was an exciting game watching them play. The Netherlands, I did an interview that we'll have coming up later in the week here, and that was with the Consul General of course, the Netherlands. So I will we'll bring that interview to you as well, and what it means in today's world to bring the world of sport and show the camaraderie, the sportsmanship, the respect for each nation. And it's not politics, it is sports. And that is such a unifying power. Again, I spoke with the Consul General of the Netherlands about it, and the Mayor of here in Surrey, British Columbia, Brenda Locke. So we'll have those reports later in the week for you. But until then, Angus, it was an amazing, amazing event.
Well, you can't beat a big sporting spectacle like that, especially when it's an international event, when you get teams from around the world competing. And well, commiserations to Canada. But I would say, I mean, you look at the population of the United States, what is it, about 340 million as opposed to, 40 million of Canada? You're up against, it's a bit of a David and Goliath situation there. So I think it's just respectful that Canada managed to become runners-up. But yeah, sport, it's such an important part of life. It is so close to the Sikh community's heart. Sport forms a very, very important part of the Sikh community, and I don't know if many Sikhs play softball or have played softball. Do let us know in the comments below if it is a game that you've ever got involved in. But certainly as a spectacle, it's great to see. We had a very big sporting weekend here in the UK as well. We had Wimbledon and the Wimbledon final yesterday. Again, it's just that time of year where sport becomes such a key proponent under the sunshine, the summer sunshine here in the Northern Hemisphere. So, but James, great to see. Look forward to hearing some reports. And again, it's as I say, it's a big, important part of life, sport, and we really need to focus our attention a bit more on sport and away from politics, maybe in life. A bit more, better for the well-being, the mental well-being.
That's right, absolutely. And of course, the opening ceremonies, we saw some politicians there. But again, it was mostly about the players. And it really was a show of sportsmanship by all of the players. No matter where they came in the finals, in the standings, they all played with passion, with respect, and with dedication. And the amount of training and dedication these young players have put in to getting to the Canada Cup is phenomenal. And it really showed with the skill levels on the fields. So again, it was an exciting week to be able to cover that, Angus. Now, in less exciting news and more darker news, we look at Air India Flight 171. Now, preliminary reports are coming out at this time about the crash that happened and whether or not this report is sharing everything or if there is information that is being withheld. Now, of course, we know India would never withhold information, would they? But the fact is that there is indications that the main fuel feed was shut off. Now, this is not something that you can accidentally shut off. This is something that actually has a guard on it, and then it also has a lever that you've got to pull out and move physically. You can't just accidentally hit it, and that's intentional for the fact that they don't want, of course, turbulence or whatever. If something happens, they don't want that button being bumped. So it's not something that can be easily done. Now, this is very concerning in the fact that there is concern that one of the pilots that was actually in the cockpit had just returned from some type of medical leave that other pilots are bringing up as a major concern. In India, part of their physical fitness and their medical fitness to fly does not include any type of psychological or mental health evaluations. The problem with this is that it could have, and I'm saying could have because there are reports that are leading this way, it could have been a pilot suicide that took all of the passengers with him. That has yet to be confirmed because a lot of information is still being withheld by the government of India and the preliminary report that's come out. There's also concerns being raised about the fact that pilots are basically worked like like mules. They are considered robots or machines because they don't get the required time down between flights all the time. They work extraordinary hours. They are really, really pushing the limits, not only in terms of the fatigue that comes with being tired, but they're not getting time to rest and recuperate with families. And therefore, we've seen an increase in the number of pilots that are going through divorces and dealing with other types of depression and other mental illness that comes with being fatigued, exhausted, and worn out. Now, this is very concerning because it's not only an India problem. This problem is actually industry-wide. Some countries, of course, and international regulations dictate certain policies, certain procedures, and certain restrictions on pilots, and what needs to be inclusive when it comes to their medical evaluations to ensure that they are ready for flight. Now, as I said, this could have been an intentional act by one of the pilots, and really the report is very vague. They refer to one of the pilots would have had to have manually shut things down. One of the pilots would have had his hands full dealing with the controls and all of that for turning to get on flight path. But they're not saying which the first or the second pilot was in control. They just, apparently they know that, or they would know this by the conversations that were had on the flight recorder system and the flight data system. Another concern is that in some of the recording, you can hear one of the pilots asking the other, "Why did you do that?" And the other pilot says, "I didn't do it." And that was right after the fuel system was shut off. And that is what they're speculating, but again, just speculating that they were referring to. It really is a dark day in the aviation industry when people have lost their lives, and it could have been something to do with the mental health or with the health leave that the pilot had just returned from. Now, I know from my days back driving buses, when you have 56 passengers behind you going with the Greyhound service across Canada, that sometimes you get passengers that get unruly in that. You don't have that partition between you and the passengers. So we know that on the flight, that is not the issue. It had to do with something in that cockpit. And I know that there are drivers that get out there behind the wheel of buses that are fatigued. They may have had the minimum number of hours off between shifts, but then they've gone home. They've dealt with family issues. They've, gotten a few hours sleep and come back to work during peak periods. And again, fatigue is a very, very hazardous condition when it comes to being responsible for the lives of 57 people or 56 people, let alone a whole airplane full. But I just bring that up because it is very relevant in the fact that there has to be restrictions that are worldwide in order for the pilots to ensure that they are flying in a safe and prepared manner and that they have the ability to be able to book off, to get that family time, to get properly rested, to ensure that they are taking care of themselves so that they can be better equipped to look after the passengers on whom the passengers are depending on them for their lives to get them to their destination safely. So again, we are watching what reports come out, and we'll keep up to date on any other information that comes out on this tragedy. And our hearts and our prayers, of course, go out to all of the families that were impacted by Flight 171. And again, we'll keep you updated if any of our viewers gather information that maybe we miss. By all means, you can feel free to email that in to us, Angus.
Yes, it's a terrible disaster, this. And of course, there's an awful lot of speculation going on around the press, as is always the case. Air India, always, as I said in the introduction, always a very provocative subject for obvious reasons when we think back to 1985. But I think what is particularly awful about this incident is it may well not have just been a crash due to technical problems. It may have been, there could have been some human error here, or some human deliberate error. And that's the big concern here. Because it does bring back awful memories of, I think it was 2015-ish, around about 10 years ago, the German wings situation. We had a flight here in Europe. It was a packed airplane of holidaymakers going from Barcelona back home to Germany. And the pilot or the co-pilot, as I seem to remember, I forget the precise details, but something like the pilot left the cockpit to go to the toilet, leaving the first officer to fly the plane. The first officer then locked the doors so the pilot couldn't get back in again, and put the plane into a descent into a mountainside. The pilot obviously not able to get back in, presumably fighting to get back into the cockpit. But the co-pilot then took charge of the plane and literally flew the plane into a mountainside, killing everybody on board. And it was a suicide. Unfortunately, it was a suicide that took 100 to 200 other innocent men, women, and children with him, which was awful. I mean, it just defies belief. And you can argue the morality of the situation, but ultimately, it was an awful situation that has changed regulations, and in fact now as a result of that particular incident, it is almost impossible to be left alone in the cockpit now of an aeroplane. Is that there will always be at least two people in an aircraft cockpit, and if there is only ever one, then anybody from the outside with the right knowledge can then still access the cockpit to avoid that very situation. So that had a huge impact on aircraft design and regulations. So this incident, James, is very concerning because, again, it does raise this spectre. And it did turn out that co-pilot who committed suicide, mass suicide as it turned out, or murder, effectively, let's call it for what it was, he was evaluated just prior to that flight as being suicidal by his own doctor, apparently, and he kept that information from the airline. In this situation, are there hints that the pilot, the co-pilot, whoever, who allegedly switched off the fuel line, was there a mental health issue there? Was there a mental crisis here? We don't know yet. No doubt the investigation will turn up more evidence. But it does raise that horrible spectre of murder by suicide, whatever phrase you want to describe this as, is that if somebody in that crew deliberately crashed that plane, they've taken an awful lot of lives with them in a hugely selfish act of suicide. We don't know, though, but as I say, it's pure speculation. And, no doubt over time, the more and more information will come out. But it's an awful situation. A lot of lives lost. And as I say, it does have awful resonance, particularly with it being Air India. And, of course, a lot of people in the community directly affected by any incident that involves Air India, James.
Yeah, and it is just such a tragedy, Angus, that so many lives so many lives are lost, but so many others are impacted forever. And, there's one individual that miraculously, I still speechless as to how he was able to escape from the plane without dying. He was the only survivor of that crash. And, maybe he'll be able to shed a bit of light, but he doesn't, from what I understand, he doesn't recall a whole lot yet. And he may never recall a lot of the incidents, and whether that's the trauma or there was an injury, it's hard to say because both can be so devastating on the mind. The mind is a very delicate instrument, and whether it is the trauma or an actual physical injury, we may never know what he knows, or he may never be able to recall it, Angus.
Yes, of course. I've forgotten about that extraordinary story. It was actually a British citizen who walked away from the crash. I mean, talking about pot luck. I mean, seat A11 his seat was, which of course now will become the most booked out seat on every aircraft in the future. But again, it just absolutely just sheer luck, God, whatever. His guardian angel was looking after him, but sadly his brother was only sitting a few seats on the same row further away, and he didn't make it. So again, just absolute sheer luck to walk away from that. Anyway, James, let's move on now, and I'm going to talk about my first story. And as I said in the introduction, this is actually quite an interesting, I would say a very concerning story here in the UK that just developed over the last few days. We have a legal process in the UK. It's called Prevent. It's a process designed particularly to try and prevent youngsters being radicalised, and it's actually primarily aimed at the Islamic community because a lot of young Muslims have been radicalised in the past and have then gone on to undertake terrorist activities, terrorist operations. So Prevent was deliberately brought in to try and reduce the amount of youngsters being induced, influenced, indoctrinated into becoming radicalised. We talk about extremism regularly. Well, this same prevent strategy has actually been targeted at the Sikh community. And the story came out that a young Sikh man, I mean, of all communities, the Sikh community is the most unlikely community to be accused of any sort of radicalisation, particularly here in the UK. And a young Sikh man was actually approached by police in Sussex, which is in the southeast of the UK here. And he was asked to sign into this process run by the local council to reduce his risk of radicalisation. Now, it was part of what's called Channel. Now, Channel is a subset of this prevent strategy. It's a particular process, and I won't go into the boring details of it, but basically he was asked to sign into this process that is called Channel. And now Channel, as well as you can see from the screen, Channel is a multi-agency safeguarding programme offered throughout the UK which focuses on providing support at an early stage to people who are identified as being vulnerable to radicalisation. And the purpose is to safeguard individuals from all forms of radicalisations. And then, so what young individuals, when they're approached by the police or representatives of the government, they are asked to sign this form, and by signing this form, they are then introduced and brought into this programme where they are de-radicalised. They are seen as potentially vulnerable to being radicalised, and then they are mentored out of it. They are through all sorts of different things. It could be through sport and education. They're provided jobs, whatever it is, but they are provided incentives to move away from that radicalisation into more productive, selfless parts of society. So in principle, the system is a good thing. It is actually designed for a very good purpose. But this young Sikh was asked to sign up to this programme. Now, and it's quite a thing to sign up to this program. You are essentially signing away a lot of rights. You are signing your rights to all sorts of things, but primarily it's also it gives your consent to all sorts of government agencies to get access to you and all your background, all your information, all your data, so that they can then use this to, well, what they call is to de-radicalise you. But of course it doesn't raise all sorts of questions. What is that information being used for? It is a coercive approach. And this young Sikh who was approached in Sussex by Sussex police, he was approached, asked to sign this, and he actually refused to do it. Now the questions were then raised. Well, why was he being seen as radicalised? The reason was he was posting regularly about the 1984 Sikh Genocide, about Shaheeds, the martyrs of the resistance during the 80s and 90s, and also about Khalistan. Now, why is that radicalising? That's a big question. This is why this whole story starts to become a little bit worrying and concerning. And he was very active on social media. And and actually this individual had also been known to be, had grown closer and closer to Sikhi. He'd maintained kez, as in his unshorn hair. He'd been growing his hair long. He'd become increasingly involved in community savour, selfless service. And basically he was being more and more brought into the Sikhi way of life. And this, by Sussex police, was being seen as becoming radicalised. Of course, he was then starting to campaign and become more active about issues very close to the Sikh heart. And therefore, he was introduced, coerced into this programme, this prevent programme. Now, interestingly, this is where it starts getting a little bit more interesting, and where the agenda behind all this actually starts becoming a little bit more transparent on behalf of the government. Now, the incident was brought to light by Sikh Youth UK. Now, Sikh Youth UK is, particularly Deepa Singh, one of the founders of Sikh Youth UK. He's a friend of the show. We talk about his experiences quite regularly. He was, in fact, I even attended his court appearance with his sister at the end of last year. He was accused of all sorts of crimes. And eventually, he and his sister were charged with crimes under the Charity Commission of all things. But what was very clear was that he and Sikh Youth UK have been targeted for many, many years by the British government and British police, and particularly West Midlands Police, because Deepa Singh and his sister and those in the organisation have been campaigning very vociferously, very aggressively about Jagtar Singh Johal, about all sorts of other issues, And more recently, they are very, very actively campaigning about the grooming gangs, the Islamic grooming gangs here in the UK, which has become a huge problem. Now, Deepa Singh was the one who actually he identified what had happened. And this young Sikh, I think, had been associated with Sikh Youth UK. So again, this agenda starts becoming a little bit clearer, is that because this youth, this young Sikh, had been working with Deepa Singh and the Sikh Youth UK organisation, is that the police had then seen him as becoming radicalised. Really? Sikh Youth UK have been very active campaigning about Khalistan, very active about Jagtar Singh Johal, very active about all the very things that the British government have become very uncomfortable about, have become rather embarrassed about, because these are uncomfortable and embarrassing and rather shameful truths about the failures of the British government. They have failed, deliberately one would question, to bring Jagtar Singh Johal home. They have been seen to have been pressured by the Indian government on so many issues relating to the Sikh community. The Indian government, we do know, pressures the British government to clamp down, particularly on the Khalistan movement, particularly on the Sikh community, and the British government have been all too happy to oblige and bend and bow to the Indian government. And so, as a result, have been targeting organisations like Sikh Youth UK who have been fighting back against this. And so, it does raise the question that this so-called Sikh extremism doesn't really exist here in the UK. If it does, show me the evidence. As I often say, show me the evidence. I see lots of activists very active out there and campaigning about these issues. I don't see any extremism or any radicalisation. But if it exists, I have an open mind. Show me the evidence. As I always say, show me the evidence. I have yet to see any evidence. Yet we see lots and lots of evidence of the British government clamping down in a very suspicious manner, I have to say, on organisations like Sikh Youth UK. Now, Deepa himself did actually say after this incident, he was quoted as saying, "This is just another example of the UK trying to create a problem of Sikh extremism," in quotation marks, which doesn't exist. We're lucky the individual involved was steadfast enough to not fall to the pressure. Fortunately, he refused to sign it as it was his right. We still have at least some form of democracy in this country. And so he refused to form and sign. And Deepa says, "We have advised them to remain anonymous for now for their own safety and general privacy." And he continued to say that he's also aware the effort to label Sevadars as radicalised goes beyond this too. We're aware even young females who've been survivors of grooming face pressure from programmes like Prevent regarding association with organisations like Sikh Youth UK. It is clear there is an agenda. We know who benefits having these young people declare themselves radicalised. It's not the Sikh community, which would get unfairly tarnished. And West Midlands Police, who were behind all sorts of targeting of Sikh Youth UK, particularly obviously in Birmingham, they have been seen to have been pressing this India agenda, this pro-India agenda. For example, Priti Patel, when she was Home Secretary for the Conservative government, she allowed India to try to extradite 3 British Sikhs to face the death penalty in India based on accusations by India which had already been investigated and dismissed. They were known as the West Midlands Three. And of course, the ongoing case of Jagtar Singh Johal. And we do know that MI6, potentially, or possibly MI5, and potentially both, are British Secret Services intelligence agencies, were known to have passed intelligence to the Indian counterparts in the Indian intelligence services that helped get Jagtar Singh Johal imprisoned when he moved across to India. So there is very clear evidence that there is an agenda at play here. It's a very concerning agenda. It's a very small incident, this, relatively speaking. It's a young Sikh who was asked to go on the Prevent programme. But what it implies, and yet again, it is more evidence that there is an agenda here of trying to label Sikh activists, Sikh campaigners as terrorists, as being radicalised. Again, there's no real evidence here. I'm waiting to see any legal evidence that there is any extremism or terrorism on behalf of the Sikh community going on in the West anywhere. Certainly here in the UK, there's no sign of it. Lots of propaganda claiming it was there. It's this horrible thing going on. Well, again, show me the evidence. And again, the agenda, more evidence that there is an agenda on behalf of the British state to try and create. If they can't find it legally, they're trying to create it indirectly by, for example, referring young savers onto the PREVENT programme, and therefore almost by implication that they are becoming radicalised, and therefore by implication they are becoming terrorists. It's all very smoke and mirrors. It's all very implied. It's all very fabricated. Again, there is no evidence that there is any Sikh extremism anywhere. I've yet to see it, certainly not here in the UK. And yet we find the British state doing its very best, very insidiously, trying to create it, trying to fabricate this nebulous potential that it could exist, even though there's no substantial or concrete evidence that it exists. It's almost by implication. It's very insidious, this, James. I find it a little bit sort of 1984, a little bit thought crime, a little bit worrying.
Absolutely, Angus. And I mean, we're hearing about, all this extremism and that, especially when it comes to the Sikh organizations that are, carrying out peaceful awareness and education campaigns, the movement towards khalistan. We're hearing a lot about the accusations of extremism. And when we look at this case in particular, it's very concerning. If somebody accuses you, maybe behind the scenes, and contacts the government, then they're trying to put you into what this comes out to as a diversion program or some type of intervention program, when it is not actually an extremist agenda and the person's not being groomed, then of course they're being falsely tagged. Now, this may not seem very influential or very important or significant to a lot of people, but when you have these type of things on a government record, if this individual goes to get employment with government, if he goes to get security clearances in sometime later in life, these things will have an impact. These things will impact his future and his opportunities. And it is just not right. It's not fair, and it's not the way that the world is supposed to work, at least in, democratic and decent communities and countries. So again, it's very concerning. And again, tomorrow night we'll be looking at another restaurant in Canada that just here down the road from the studios here in Vancouver and Surrey, that was shot up. And all of a sudden, the India media, boom, it's the Sikh extremists shooting up this comedian and entertainer's restaurant. No evidence whatsoever, except that it is being reported by the Hindutva media. And again, very curious as to how, but some of the Hindutva media had social media video or cell phone video before anybody else here locally had it. It somehow made its way to India before it made it here locally. So I think, again, they are targeting the wrong groups. They are not looking at the Hindutva and the threats that they pose, but instead they are trying to follow an agenda that may be being pushed by certain individuals or certain government entities, saying you've got to go after this individual because they're being extremists or they're being subjected to grooming and all of that, Angus. It's really concerning in the Western world right now when it comes to that type of behavior.
Yeah, it is the propaganda war, which we talk about on a regular basis.
Yeah.
This
right.
terrible battle to control the narrative, and clearly India is very much throwing a lot of resources at it. But it's very concerning here in the UK that a young lad who literally was just actively campaigning about the 1984 genocide in Khalistan suddenly gets accused of becoming radicalised. I mean, does that by implication means, well, I'm here on a daily basis talking about Khalistan and Jagtar Singh Johal. I'm campaigning vociferously myself about highlighting the 1984 Sikh genocide. Does that mean I'm becoming radicalised? Of course it doesn't. But of course, well, I'm not going to tempt fate here and say they're not coming to put me on the PREVENT programme. Who knows? Maybe they will. But of course, the likelihood is they won't, because of course then that highlights how ridiculous the situation is. But they can get away with it more with the Sikh community because, the general population say, oh yeah, maybe it's true. If they see me being accused of being radicalised, of course they'll realise the nonsense for what it is. But they can get away with it with a Sikh youth here in the UK. So again, it's very very dangerous. It's a slippery slope, which again we must keep highlighting to ensure that
absolutely. Listen, just one more point on that, if I may, and that is the fact that, as you said, it would be ludicrous for them to come and tell you to your face, you're being radicalized. But instead, the question is, what list are you on? What list am I on? That the India government is saying, hey, we don't like what these guys are saying, even though it's true and we've got the receipts to back it up. But what's to stop them from trying to accuse us of being radicalized and being put on certain lists as we travel, the world? If we go to another country, are we going to pop up on a list somewhere?
Indeed, absolutely. And in fact, the last time I tried to get into the United States, I had a terrible time getting in because I am now linked with the Khalistan movement, and I was interrogated at great length by US border control. And in the end, they let me through, fortunately. And I guess they had to, because I've certainly broken no laws. And as I say, it's almost by association. And this is the issue, really. And this is where democracy really is potentially under threat through things like this, through propaganda and misinformation, and particularly when pressure comes from countries like India, that obviously do hold a lot of weight and sway with Western nations, because again, of many things that we talk about, trade deals, etc. And it is an area of huge concern. And when we talk about misinformation and propaganda war, of course, my second story, which actually looks at this again in great detail and talk about getting control of the narrative, is that Western political policy is often influenced by actors who are very active in trying to highlight problems where they exist in our societies. And one of the big actors, and I use that word loosely, one of the actors involved in the United States, for example, is a well-known Hindutva organisation. That, of course, is the HAF, the Hindu American Foundation. Now, the HAF have been, again, it's an organisation that we've mentioned quite regularly here on Perspectives, because they have been very active across North America in terms of campaigning on behalf of the Hindu population, particularly the Hindu diaspora in the United States, and of course their attacks on the Sikh community and indeed other diaspora communities, but particularly the Sikh community has been targeted by this HAF. Now, interestingly, of course, in the fight back against this tsunami of fake news and misinformation spread by the HAF, who are, of course, pushing this Hindutva agenda, is that we often say, of course, a lot of their accusations are nonsense. They're based on absolute nonsense. And they do try very hard to infiltrate areas like industry, politics, commerce, academia. They've got their puppets, their people, their place people in places of power to spread and push this agenda. And obviously we, amongst many others, particularly in the Sikh community, push back on this regularly, saying, no, this is fake information, it's fake news, it is misinformation. Well, fortunately, we are not alone in this, because the Jewish community have also stepped up to the plate. And they said, no, this HAF are actually pushing an agenda that is not true. They are pushing a fake agenda, basically on behalf of Hindutva. And they've written a very interesting article that was released actually last week when we were away. And I just wanted to highlight this article. It's a very, very long article, so of course I'm not going to bore you with about 4,000 words of it. But I just want to just cherry pick, as I often do, just cherry pick some key bits of information that this article picked out themselves. It's written from the perspective of the Jewish community, but it does highlight exactly what is going on with the HAF and how they have been targeting groups like the Sikh community, particularly in the United States. Right. And they've given lots of evidence of this. And they start off the article by they give one example of essentially a hate crime. It happened with a group of Bengali-speaking Indian American women who were accosted by a non-Indian woman. And basically, this group of Bengali speakers were abused. It was a plain and simple, good old-fashioned hate crime. And among the many reacting with outrage to what this harassment was, of course, the HAF. And then they go on to another example where in Fremont, California, where again there's a very large Sikh community. In California and Fremont, a Hindu was waiting in line at a Taco Bell, and he was verbally abused by a fellow Indian American who called him well, I'm not going to repeat the phrases, it's pretty rude. But basically he was abused by a fellow Indian American. And then the HAF wrote that these two incidents together represented the same, what they called seething hatred, both involving, and this is important, racist and Hindu-phobic invectives. Now, it's very clear that when the Jewish Currents, the news outlet that investigated this and investigated all these crimes, these so-called hate crimes, when they investigated this, they said that first attack against the Bengali women was not Hindu phobia. It was nothing to do with Hindu phobia. And they're concerned that defining this incident as specifically anti-Hindu, rather than basically for what it was an anti-Indian racist hate crime. It was not anti-Hindu. You're blurring the lines. Now, HAF's response to this was just one among scores of claims of Hindu phobia that this right-wing Hindu-American group has made in recent years. And they have actually collated, now Jewish Currents reviewed all HAF's public communications. They have collated at least 200 separate incidents that they claimed were Hindu-phobic or anti-Hindu in press releases, websites, tweets and all sorts of things in 5 years between 2019 and 2024. And they also noted in their research that other organisations have followed the same pattern. The Coalition of Hindus of North America, for example, began collating incidents of what they called hate and violence against Hindus on their website starting in 2020. And then a student-led group called Hindu on Campus set up what they called a Hindu phobia tracker, again, that then tried to collate what they called attacks against Hindus and Hindu phobia. And over time, these groups' attempts to raise the alarm about this so-called Hindu phobia have translated into policy. And this goes back to what I started off this story about, was that when you start collating data, policy starts being made to tackle the problems that this data presents. And I often always talk about how it's important for the Sikh community to report hate crimes, because that data is then collected, statistics are produced, which then influences policy, influences the government agenda. Well, that's exactly what the Hindus, the Hindutva forces are doing. They realise that if they can collect as much so-called alleged Hindu phobia, they can collect that data, present it to policymakers, and policy is then written to prevent Hindu phobia. Essentially, it promotes the Hindutva agenda, and that's what this is all about. As has been indeed seen, is that city and state level policies have been influenced by successful campaigning against so-called Hindutva. Now, Jewish Currents themselves did their own investigation, again, of all these incidents. They found that 75% of incidents that were condemned as Hindu phobia by the HAF in the US did not meet the group's own definition of Hindu phobia. In other words, they're not Hindu phobia at all, yet 3/4 of these incidents were labelled as Hindu phobia, which in turn went on to influence policy, were not actually Hindu phobia. They were actually completely different. They were different types of hate crimes or different types of incidents. 20 of the incidents involved criticism of Hindutva itself. Now, that's not a Hindu phobia incident. It's a criticism of extremist nationalism of Hindutva. That's a very different thing. It's a political thing. 12 allegations of Hindu phobia were levelled at activists aiming to ban the caste system in the US. So again, not Hindu phobia, they were campaigning against the evils of the caste system that the Hindutva are trying to push into the US diaspora. 36 of those featured hate crimes weren't directed at the person's religious identity. In other words, not the fact that they were Hindus, but rather they were just generic race immigrant status. In other words, it was just against the colour of their skin, basically. It was nothing to do with the fact that they were Hindus. And again, it just highlights the fact that, again, the agenda is being influenced by Hindutva manipulation of the statistics. Now, again, the Jewish outlet investigated this, and they talked to more than a dozen scholars, experts and activists, and they said that the HAF has political incentives to describe as many incidents as anti-Hindu as possible. For decades, the position of the group's founders have been aligned with Hindu nationalism, as we know. HAF has consistently supported supremacist policies of Modi's government. And the co-founder and editor of the Indian fact-checking platform Alt News told Jewish Currents that the whole Hindu nationalist project is one of misrepresentation and misinformation, and that groups like HAF create a narrative of Hindu victimhood in order to advance their politics. There it is in black and white. Even the co-founder of an Indian fact-checking platform has said that this is Hindutva mischief. This is basically the Hindutva pushing their agenda. And I would also just append this story by reminding people that Gurdwara in Fremont is actually now taking legal action to try and highlight the links between the HAF and the Indian government, because if they are seen to be acting as an agent of the Indian government, which clearly they are, and particularly of Hindutva, they have to declare themselves as such. And by not doing so, they are breaking US law. So in other words, they are forcing HAF and any sister organisations to suddenly become transparent and to highlight any connections to Hindutva and therefore any proof that they are actually pushing the Hindutva agenda. And that narrative, that legal action is being pushed very aggressively by the diaspora group in Fremont in California. Good luck to them for doing that. So the fight back, as I said when I covered that story, the fight back is continuing. But there you go, James. It's in black and white. Hindutva is really pushing itself through HAF, and it's being called out not just by the Sikh community, but even the Jewish community is now seeing it.
And we've seen the new branch of the HCF, the Indo-Canadian Foundation, that's popped up now, and it seems to be that they are trying to push a narrative throughout the Western world to back up their claims and what their agenda is. And that should be very concerning. But the bright side, Angus, is that a lot of countries, whether it's in the mainstream media or not, are really clamping down on foreign interference and transnational repression. Now, that includes the UK, it includes the US, it includes Canada. Could there be more? Absolutely. Absolutely there should be, because there's something called the crime index. There's the national crime index, there is the regional, there's provincial, and then there's a community crime index. These break down the types of crimes in the different regions, and the community one is really relevant here in terms of this area, because it looks at, for example, the city of Surrey. What areas of the city are having the most reports of whether it's violent crime, whether it's property crime, and hate crime or racially motivated crimes. So this allows the city to put the resources in that community to ensure that they are dealing with it appropriately, as well as the city to look at, can we do more in terms of education, in terms of awareness, in terms of inclusion. And those resources are very instrumental in helping to unify communities and to break down the crap that the HAF and other organizations are putting out there. And it's good to see that there are places, including the Jewish Congress and others, that are calling out what they see on behalf of other racially segregated or impacted groups as well. So again, if you are the legitimate target of a hate crime, make sure that you report it. Again, those crime index reports are very valuable to the politicians, to law enforcement, even to school districts in order to make sure they are allocating the resources where they need to be pointed, Angus.
Indeed, and a very important point that is any hate crime, however minor, always report it, because that is the foundation of what changes policy. That is what highlights what is going on out there. And that is the only way that things will ever change. And the truth will ever come out that, in fact, the real phobia here is an anti-Sikh phobia that's going on out there. It is not a Hindu phobia at all. So, anyway, James, on that note, let's move on to our comments column. Now then, our first comment of the day comes from Amarjeet Makar. Now, this is an interesting comment, and I wanted to go through this. It's quite a long comment, but it's a very well-written comment. In fact, James, I have to say I'm slightly suspicious about this comment, because I wonder, I have to say, having read a lot of AI-written stuff, it's almost like it's been written by AI. But anyway, let's give the comment the benefit of the doubt. It is a very well-written comment, and it's all about, is a Sikh Indian? We talked a lot about this in one of our shows just before we went away. And of course, it did actually provoke a lot of comments. But this comment really is a very interesting one. It brings up a few points which I do want to actually talk about as talking points. And are Sikhs Indian? And yes, you start off by saying, yes, Sikhs who are citizens of India are considered Indian. Okay, technically correct. there is but a debatable point about whether Sikhs would see themselves as Indian. That is another point. Then you talk about in a few sort of bullet points a little bit of the history and general makeup of the Sikh population. But what you say is, it's important to note Sikhism is a global religion and not all Sikhs are Indian citizens. People of other ethnicities have likewise become Sikhs. And you say that Sikhs have actively pushed for greater visibility and awareness against discrimination and prejudice. That's what we've just been talking about globally as well as in the US. And then they have faced discrimination and controversies concerning religious rights. And again, we talk about, for example, wearing the kirpan. And as you rightly say, you're referring to religious head coverings, the dastar, the turban, etc., and wearing the kirpan. Yes, that has become a very big issue. And you rightly say that wearing articles of faith does make Sikhs potentially targets of prejudice and hate crime. Now, this is where it starts getting interesting. And again, where I sort of suspect AI may have got involved in here. Some Sikhs support separatist movements like Khalistan. The majority of Sikhs do not follow such statements. Now, if you do, as you've done, James, if you do an AI sort of thing on Khalistan and Sikhi and things like that, it comes up with similar statements like this, very similar statements, where it makes these grand sweeping statements saying, no, the majority of Sikhs don't support Khalistan, but a small minority do. It's a fringe element. Yeah, that's what the aggregate, the average of the internet probably says, because the average is controlled, the narrative that is widely spread out by India and this massive Hindutva campaign. The message that the narrative that the Hindutva campaign spreads across the internet is a small movement. It is a fringe element, that the majority of Sikhs don't follow such statements. That is what the average of the internet seems to say, because that huge resource of India is spreading that narrative. But that is not the truth. We do know it's not the truth, because the real evidence, the actual empirical evidence on the ground. Look at the diaspora. The referendum, the Khalistan referendum, is overwhelmingly pro-Khalistan. Even though we haven't had the results, we don't even need to know the results. Just by looking at the number of flags, the Khalistan flags, the makeup of the people that attend the referendum right across the diaspora, it is huge. The pro-Khalistan movement across the diaspora is huge. In India itself, in the Punjab, we do know that the majority of Punjabis are pro-Khalistan. How do we know that? Because the election of Amritpal Singh and another Punjabi MP, both campaigning on pro-Khalistani tickets, both elected with massive, unprecedented majorities. That implies democratically that Punjab is probably pro-Khalistan by a large margin. So again, that's a point that's very debatable there. And then you say, they talk about calls for a uniform civil code in India. Some oppose it with concerns about Hindu Rashtra. This is again about unifying the civil code, the law in India to cover all things under the guise of equality. But some say, it is, particularly amongst the Sikh community, that it's used to actually potentially discriminate through the back door the Sikh community. Yeah, probably true. Allegations exist about potential propaganda and censorship aimed at influencing the Sikh community in the West and stifling dissent. There's no allegations about this. We provide proof on a daily basis about how much propaganda and misinformation is out there targeting the Sikh community in the West and stifling dissent. It's not propaganda, it's fact, provable fact. We do it over and over again. And then you finish off, and then again, this is why I think it's potentially written by AI. It's crucial to acknowledge this is a complex situation, different, blah, blah, blah. So, James, as I say, I think there's some interesting points here, but I do wonder, is it a genuine comment or is it AI? What are your thoughts?
I call BS on the AI or on this article, saying that it is definitely AI. You look at the format of the comment, you look at the word, the context, just the whole layout, and it just screams AI to me. I would be very, very shocked if it wasn't AI, but I'm pretty convinced it is.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, it smacked to me of AI. I hope I'm wrong, and apologies if I am to Amarjeet Makkar, if this is a genuine comment that you have written. But ultimately, well, there you go. And maybe our audience can give their thoughts on that. And maybe Amarjeet can actually respond personally and let us know, did you go to dip into AI to do this or not? Is this your own work, as they say? Yeah. Anyway, let's see. However, the debate did continue. There are a lot of comments we did receive on this. And Aj Tak News Ind said, and this is a comment of two halves almost, Sikhs have an Indian passport. Punjab is a state in the Union of India. And I suppose there the implication is, well, of course, Sikhs and Punjabi Sikhs are Indian because they form under the Union of India. And again, technically that is true. Sikhs technically are Indian, but what really matters is, do they see themselves as Indian? This is really what the debate is about. Do they actually see themselves as Indian? And it's like, some Sikhs without question do see themselves as India. That's fine, that is their prerogative. But it is also the democratic right of Sikhs within the Punjab who don't identify as Indian, who actually see the history and the bigger story of this, saying that India is an artificial construct, is the Punjab is not really Indian. The Punjab the greater Punjab as it used to be is actually as a separate state, and they have never identified themselves as Indian. They have identified themselves as Sikhs, as Punjabis, whatever you want to call themselves, but they do not see themselves as Indian. And then the second half of this comment, which is slightly juxtaposed to this, Indian army kills its own Union citizens. Indeed they do. For example, in the Kashmir, Manipur, Nagaland, Tamil, Sri Lanka, etc., etc. Absolutely right they do. And this again is why I constantly say I have no doubt India is likely to break up, because it is held together, this union, this so-called union, which was artificially created by the British and then inherited by the Brahmins. It is going to break apart like the Soviet Union, like Yugoslavia, because you can't keep something like that together indefinitely. You can't beat human nature. You cannot defy the laws of physics, James.
Yeah, absolutely, Angus, and it's very interesting to look at, and the force or the lack of hindsight there for a lot of people is that they don't look beyond partition. They don't look beyond going back prior to the colonization by the British and recognize that the Sikh Empire was there, and that is a part of the foundation on which there has to be a sovereign identity for the Sikhs.
And this is actually where it becomes a little bit insidious. In that India recognised that the way to indoctrinate Sikhs into thinking that they are Indian is to get in at the schools, is to get the youth, is to indoctrinate the schools. This is why they're flooding the schools with Hindi-speaking teachers. They're removing the Punjabi speakers and replacing them with Hindi-speaking. And the syllabus is very pro-India, very united India. It's removing any identity of Sikhs. It's removing Sikh culture, Sikh identity from schools, because they know that those young Sikhs, as they grow up, are going to become indoctrinated into the belief that, we are Indian. That's how it works. We saw it, for example, with the European Union. Here in the UK, schools were absolutely filled with pro-EU propaganda. All the textbooks had EU flags, pro-EU messages. It's very, very insidious. It's all about indoctrinating the youth, knowing that as they grow up, they will then become advocates and promoters of, in this case, of India, etc. So again, very, very, very insidious, I would say there. But Amrit Singh really wraps up this debate by saying very clearly, and is in no two minds about what it's all about, Sikhs are not Indian. I couldn't put it better, James.
Absolutely.
And one day, hopefully, that will manifest itself in, of course, Khalistan. Now, truth said, this is a big point, and we don't have really time to sort of go into this, but yeah, you said, can we speak more about why Sikh leaders in 1947, that time of partition, chose India over sovereignty? Did the British make them an offer for a separate homeland, but they turned it down? Well, what it was all about, and again, we can't really go into too much detail, but I have talked about this in a lot of my podcasts. A lot of my podcast guests have given a lot of information about what really happened. It was Nehru, and it was Gandhi, and it was the power brokers in 1947 who basically duped the Sikh leaders at that time. They made all sorts of promises. The British actually had stepped away to a large extent, and it wasn't really the British that had much influence in this. The British handed over power to the Brahmins, the Brahmin elite, let's call it, of course, of whom people like Gandhi and Nehru formed a large part of that. And they were the power brokers. They were basically the people who were making the decisions at that time. Sikh leaders were, of course, invited. They were invited to the party, but they were a minority. And they were made all sorts of promises. Yeah, of course you can have, we will give you all sorts of autonomy. And really your second part here, were they fooled because of the lack of wisdom and foresight? No, it wasn't because of the lack of wisdom and foresight. It is an inherent, I would almost say a weakness, but it is a moral weakness of the Sikh community. Sikhs are by default, by nature, a trusting community. Sikhs will always trust somebody by default until it is proved otherwise. That is to their credit, but it is also to their disadvantage. And this is exactly what happened in 1947. They trusted people like Nehru and Gandhi and the Brahmins. These people who promised them, yes, of course we will give you, if you support us, you support our plan, we will then give you all sorts of autonomy and potential sovereignty. And of course, they were betrayed. The Brahmins, of course, knew full well they were never going to give independence, sovereignty, autonomy to the Sikh people. That was never on the agenda. They were fooled. They were fooled, and it wasn't through lack of wisdom and foresight. It was literally because they are good human beings who trusted their fellow human beings. And that was the mistake they made, James.
Absolutely, and I couldn't have wrapped that up any better, Angus. That is dead on my thought on it as well. And that is something that we can talk about further in another episode. We'll definitely look at bringing a segment on that.
Yeah, a sad indictment of humanity. I learned the older I've got, the less and less you can trust human beings. Stuff to Muffins says, it's a pity that India, so beautiful and diverse nation, but in the hands of Hindutva, are all suffering. Only Sikhs and a few raise their voices, but the majority enjoy the might of Hindutva. Soon they may have to pay for the silence. Well, that's a big point, and we could talk for hours about that one, James.
Absolutely, and I'll just let you go through the other comments in the interest of time, because I could go on quite a bit about that one.
Indeed. But the one point I would raise on that, it is primarily the Sikh community that are raising the voice against it. And this is why the Sikh community are such a target because of doing that. Gurinder Singh Gill says, thank you for speaking up. It is a pleasure and honour. And as a Sikh, we have warrior blood. This is what Sikhs are. This is what they identify as. They're not Indians. They are warriors. And I like this comment because it says Sikhs have warrior blood created by our gurus as we fight for truth, equality and oneness. And I think that absolutely sums up what Sikhi is about, what the Sikh community is. Genetically, they are warriors born of a grand heroic history, and I love to talk about the great history of the Sikh community. And TC finishes off with a great statement: North, South, East and West, Khalistan is the very best. Khalistan Zindabad, James.
Beautifully said.
And I couldn't finish the show on a better point, really. But there, unfortunately, we have run over time as always. We must bring perspectives to close. Don't forget to keep these comments coming. Thank you so much for all your comments that have come in our absence. Much appreciated. Do keep them coming in. Don't forget you can message us directly at message@satellage.tv.com if there's anything you'd like to bring to our attention directly. But that is it for another day. Thanks so much for watching. It is a goodbye from me. It is a goodbye from James.
Stay safe, everyone.
You have, of course, been watching Perspectives. We will see you next time.